The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Thompson's well-kept front yard as the 93-year-old veteran slowly made his way to his favorite wooden rocking chair on the porch. His weathered hands, still steady despite his age, carefully placed his morning coffee on the small table beside him. Every morning for the past 47 years, this had been his ritual, watching the neighborhood come to life from his spot at 823 Pine Street. Harold wasn't like most elderly folks who needed help with daily tasks. Even at 93, he managed his home all by himself. His lawn was always neatly trimmed, his white picket fence freshly painted, and his garden bloomed with the prettiest flowers in the neighborhood. The local children often called him Grandpa Harold, though he had no grandchildren of his own. Inside his modest two-bedroom house, every wall told a story. Old photographs hung in simple wooden frames. Pictures of Harold in his World War II medic uniform, standing proud and tall. Next to these were photos of his late wife, Martha, who had served as a nurse during the same war. That's where they had met, amid the chaos of war, saving lives together in a field hospital in France. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Harold would put on his navy blue veteran's cap, the one with World War II medic stitched in gold, and drive his well-maintained 1985 Buick to the local veterans center. The younger veterans there loved his stories, not just about the war, but about life and love and everything in between. He had a special way of telling stories that made everyone lean in closer to listen. The key to a long life, he would often tell them with a gentle smile, is to keep your hands busy and your heart open. And he lived by these words. His garage was filled with woodworking tools, and he still made beautiful birdhouses that he gave away to neighbors. Sometimes he would spend hours teaching the neighborhood kids how to build simple wooden toys, just like his father had taught him many years ago. Mrs. Chen from next door often brought him homemade dumplings, and in return, Harold shared vegetables from his garden. It was this kind of simple friendship that made Pine Street special. Everyone looked out for each other, and Harold was like the grandfather of the whole street. But things started to change one cloudy Tuesday afternoon. Harold was tending to his prize roses when he heard the first rumble of motorcycles. At first, he didn't think much of it. But then the noise grew louder and more frequent. A group of bikers had bought the old Wilson warehouse just 2 blocks away. The building had been empty for years, its red bricks fading and windows gathering dust. Now it was coming alive again, but not in the way anyone had expected. That evening, as Harold sat in his living room, looking at Martha's picture above the fireplace, he could hear the distant sound of loud music and motorcycles. The noise wasn't too bad yet, but something in his gut told him this was just the beginning. He had seen enough in his long life to know when trouble was brewing. Still, Harold wasn't one to judge people too quickly. Everyone deserves a chance to be a good neighbor, he said to himself, remembering how his own father had taught him to give people the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, he even thought about baking his famous apple pie, the same recipe Martha had loved, and taking it over to welcome the newcomers. As he went about his evening routine that night, checking the locks, watering his indoor plants, and saying goodnight to Martha's picture, Harold hoped that Pine Street would stay the peaceful place it had always been, the street where children played safely, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where an old veteran could live out his days in quiet dignity. Little did Harold know that his peaceful world was about to be tested in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. But then again, Harold Thompson wasn't just any 93-year-old veteran. He had faced worse challenges in his life, and he had always found a way to make things right, not through force, but through understanding and wisdom that only comes with 93 years of living life with an open heart. The first real signs of trouble came on a Friday night. Harold was watching his favorite old war documentary when the walls of his house began to shake. The sound of revving motorcycles and heavy metal music bounced off every window. He turned up his TV's volume, but it was no use. The noise from the warehouse was too loud. Around midnight, Harold picked up his phone and called the local police. Officer Jenny Martinez, who had known Harold for years, answered the call. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," she said after listening to his complaint. "As long as they quiet down by 1 a.m., they're within their rights. But I'll drive by and have a word with them." True to her word, Officer Martinez visited the warehouse. The music got a little quieter, but the bikers made sure to rev their engines extra loud as she drove away. From his window, Harold could see them laughing and pointing in the direction of his house. The next morning, while Harold was having his breakfast, Mrs. Chen came over in tears. "They scared my grandson Tommy last night," she said, her hands shaking as Harold poured her some tea. He was riding his bicycle home from his friend's house, and they surrounded him on their motorcycles. They didn't hurt him, but they frightened him badly. Harold's old military training kicked in. He started keeping a notebook of every incident. The noise violations were just the beginning. Soon, empty beer cans started appearing in his garden. The peaceful afternoon card games that the neighborhood seniors used to enjoy on Harold's porch became impossible because of the constant motorcycle noise. One Tuesday, as Harold drove home from the Veterans Center, he noticed something different about Pine Street. The usual group of children playing hopscotch was gone. Mr. Rodriguez's grandchildren no longer played baseball in their front yard. The street that had once been full of life now felt empty and scared. The biker group, who called themselves the Night Ravens, had about 20 members. Their leader, who everyone called Spike, was a tall man with tattoos covering his arms and neck. Every time Harold drove past the warehouse in his Buick, Spike would make motorcycle engine sounds with his mouth, and his friends would laugh. Harold tried talking to other neighbors about going to the city council together, but most were too afraid to speak up. "What if they damage our cars?" one neighbor whispered. "What if they hurt our kids?" another worried. The fear in their voices reminded Harold of the scared civilians he'd helped during the war, people who needed someone to stand up for them. Even the local shop owners were affected. Mr. Parker, who ran the small grocery store, told Harold that the bikers would come in groups, intimidating other customers and sometimes forgetting to pay for their snacks and drinks. But he was too scared to call the police. One evening, Harold decided to count the different problems in his notebook. In just 2 weeks, there had been 12 nights of loud music past midnight, 8 complaints from neighbors about intimidation, 6 cases of littering in his garden, 4 incidents of bikers following school children on their way home, 3 cases of vandalism at the local park. The police had been called 15 times by different neighbors, but nothing changed. The bikers always seemed to know exactly how far they could go without breaking any serious laws. They were smart about their bullying, keeping just within legal limits while making life miserable for everyone. That night, as Harold looked at Martha's picture, he remembered something she used to say during the war. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back, it's finding a better way to solve the problem." He thought about those words as he watched through his window. The bikers were having another party, the shadows dancing on the warehouse walls. Harold went to bed that night with the noise still pounding through his walls, but his mind was already working on a plan. Tomorrow, he would try something different. If the police couldn't help, and the neighbors were too scared to act, maybe it was time for this old veteran to show these bikers what real strength looked like. But first, he needed his morning coffee and perhaps a slice of courage from his memories of serving alongside some of the bravest men and women he'd ever known. On a warm Wednesday evening, Harold finally decided it was time to speak directly with the bikers. He put on his best flannel shirt, adjusted his veteran's cap, and walked slowly but purposefully toward the warehouse. The sound of laughter and motorcycle engines grew louder with each step. As Harold approached the warehouse entrance, a few bikers noticed him. They nudged each other, smirking. Spike, their leader, was sitting on his chrome-plated motorcycle, polishing the handlebars with an old rag. When he saw Harold, a mocking smile spread across his face. Well, if it isn't Grandpa time coming to visit," Spike called out, causing several bikers to laugh. "Did we interrupt your afternoon nap, old-timer?" Harold stood straight, just as he had done during military inspections decades ago. "Young man," he said in a clear, steady voice, "I've come to have a civilized conversation about the noise and the way you've been treating our neighborhood." The laughter grew louder. One biker revved his engine to drown out Harold's words. Another one walked circles around Harold, making exaggerated old man shuffling movements. But Harold didn't move. He faced German artillery in his youth. These theatrics didn't shake him. "Your music keeps people awake at night," Harold continued. "Children are afraid to play outside. This isn't right, and you know it." Spike got off his motorcycle and walked up to Harold, towering over him. "Listen, Gramps," he said, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Maybe it's time for you to move to one of those nice retirement homes. You know, where everything's quiet and boring. Just like you." The mockery hurt more than Harold showed, but it wasn't the words that bothered him most. It was watching these young men waste their energy on intimidation instead of doing something meaningful with their lives. He remembered young soldiers he treated during the war, brave men not much older than these bikers, who had given everything for their country. "I fought for your right to live freely," Harold said firmly. "But freedom comes with responsibility. You're better than this bullying." Something in Harold's words must have struck a nerve. Spike's face darkened. He grabbed an empty beer can and threw it, landing it perfectly in Harold's prized rosebush. "Your war stories don't mean anything here, old man. Times have changed. This is our territory now." Other bikers started throwing their cans too, turning it into a game. 10 points if you hit his mailbox," one shouted. 20 if you get it in his garden," yelled another. Harold watched as his carefully tended garden became their target practice. Each can that landed felt like a bullet, not to his body, but to his heart. He'd survived World War II only to be treated like this in his own neighborhood. As he turned to leave, one of the younger bikers called out, "Hey, Grandpa, still think your generation was the greatest?" The question was followed by more laughter and the roar of engines. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. The noise from the warehouse was worse than ever, almost like they were celebrating their confrontation with him. Around 2 a.m., he heard the sound of spray paint cans outside his house. Looking through his window, he saw 3 bikers vandalizing his fence. They were writing "Old Time" in the Argo Hooni in large red letters. Harold's hands shook as he picked up his phone to call the police, but he put it down again. Officer Martinez had already told him there wasn't much they could do unless the bikers caused serious damage or hurt someone. The law, it seemed, wasn't on his side. As he sat in his darkened living room, Harold's eyes fell on an old photograph. It showed him with his medical unit during the war. They were all smiling despite the terrible conditions, united by their sense of purpose and brotherhood. Something about that photo sparked an idea in his mind. These bikers thought they could break his spirit with their mockery and vandalism. They thought his age made him weak. But Harold Thompson hadn't survived a world war by being weak. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would show them what real strength looks like, not the strength of fists or loud motorcycles, but the strength that comes from wisdom, experience, and knowing how to fight battles in ways your opponent never expects. Dawn broke over Pine Street with an unusual stillness. Harold woke up early, as he always did, but this morning felt different. As he stepped onto his front porch, his heart stopped. The American flag that had draped Martha's coffin, his most precious possession, lay crumpled and torn on the ground. This wasn't just any flag. When Martha passed away 5 years ago, the military had presented it to Harold in honor of her service as a war nurse. Every morning since then, he had raised that flag with careful hands, remembering how Martha had saved countless lives alongside him in that field hospital in France. Harold's legs felt weak as he knelt down to pick up the flag. Someone had cut the rope on the flagpole, and there were motorcycle tire tracks across his lawn, leading right up to it. The flag itself was stained with what smelled like beer, and one of its stars had been partially torn off. Inside his house, Harold placed the damaged flag on his dining room table. His hands trembled as he tried to fold it properly, just as he had done thousands of times before. But the torn fabric wouldn't cooperate. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks, not from sadness, but from a deep, burning anger he hadn't felt since his war days. Mrs. Chen found him sitting there an hour later. She had come over with her usual Thursday morning dumplings and gasped when she saw the state of the flag. "Oh, Harold," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is too much. We must do something." Harold nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Yes, we must." He stood up, straightened his back, and walked out his front door. This time he didn't head to the warehouse, he walked right into the middle of Pine Street. Standing there, in his faded blue pajamas and slippers, Harold began to speak. His voice, trained by years of giving orders in chaotic field hospitals, carried clearly through the morning air. "I know you're watching," he called out, addressing the warehouse where several bikers were already gathering. "You think you're tough? Let me tell you about tough." Neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the unusual sight of Harold standing in the street. Even Spike and his gang came out to watch, some of them snickering. "I've seen tough," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've seen 18-year-old boys hold their best friends together while waiting for medics. I've seen nurses, like my Martha, work for 48 hours straight, saving lives under enemy fire. The snickering from the bikers stopped. Harold pointed to his torn flag, now clutched in his left hand. This flag isn't just a piece of cloth. It was given to me when I lost my wife, a woman who served her country proudly. She saved lives while you destroy property. She helped people while you terrorize them. His words echoed down the street. More neighbors appeared on their porches. Mr. Rodriguez was filming everything on his phone. Even the morning traffic had stopped to listen. I've treated men who lost limbs defending your right to ride those motorcycles. I've comforted soldiers as they took their last breath so you could have the freedom to act like fools. But this? He held up the damaged flag. This shows you don't understand the first thing about strength or respect. Harold's voice cracked with emotion, but he stood taller than ever. You want to bully an old man? Fine, but remember this, I've faced real monsters in my life, young men who thought power came from causing fear. They lost. Just like you're losing right now, losing your humanity over what? Over making an old man's life miserable. Some of the younger bikers began to look uncomfortable. One of them, a lean young man with a military-style haircut, stepped away from the group, his eyes fixed on the torn flag. I'm not moving, Harold declared. I'm not giving up my home, and I'm not letting you dishonor everything this flag stands for. So go ahead, show everyone what real cowardice looks like by picking on a 93-year-old veteran, or maybe, just maybe, find the courage to be better men than this. With those words, Harold turned and walked back toward his house, leaving a profound silence in his wake. He didn't look back at the bikers. He didn't need to. For the first time since this trouble began, he felt like he was back in control, not through violence or intimidation, but through the quiet strength that comes from standing up for what's right. After Harold's powerful speech, an unusual silence fell over Pine Street. He sat in his living room, holding Martha's damaged flag, when a soft knock came at his door. Opening it, he found the young biker who had stepped away from the group earlier, the one with the military haircut. Sir, the young man said, shifting nervously on his feet, I'm Mike. I served in Afghanistan, 3rd Infantry Division. His eyes were fixed on the flag in Harold's hands. Harold studied the young man's face. Behind the tough biker exterior, he saw something familiar. The same haunted look he'd seen in countless young soldiers' eyes during and after the war. Come in, son, Harold said quietly. Inside, Mike's eyes darted around the room, taking in the military photographs on the walls. He stopped at a black and white picture of Harold in his medic uniform. You were really there, Mike said softly. World War II. Normandy to Berlin, Harold replied. Patched up more young men than I can count. He gestured to his worn but comfortable armchair. Want to tell me what a combat veteran is doing terrorizing neighborhoods? Mike sat down, his leather jacket creaking. His fingers traced a tattoo on his arm, the infantry insignia. I came back 8 months ago, he began. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't hold a job. The bikes, the noise, it drowns out the thoughts, you know? Harold nodded. He knew all too well. And Spike's group took you in. They don't ask questions, Mike explained. Don't care if I wake up screaming. Don't look at me different when my hands shake. He paused, looking at the torn flag. But this isn't what I fought for. This isn't what any of us fought for. Harold walked to his kitchen and returned with 2 cups of coffee. Tell me about Afghanistan, he said, handing Mike a cup. Tell me about your unit. For the next hour, Mike talked. He spoke about the friends he'd lost, the children he'd seen in war-torn villages, the constant fear. Harold listened, occasionally sharing his own experiences from another war, another time. Despite the decades between their service, the feelings were the same. You know what saved me after the war? Harold asked, pointing to a photo of Martha in her nurse's uniform. Having someone who understood. Martha and I could talk about things others wouldn't understand. The nightmares, the guilt, the fear, we shared it all. Mike's coffee had gone cold, untouched. I don't have that, he admitted. The VA meetings feel too formal. The bikers, they're just looking for trouble. But when I saw that flag today, his voice cracked. Harold reached for an old wooden box on his shelf. Inside was his combat medic badge, still shining after all these years. We medics had a saying, he said, holding the badge. Everyone bleeds the same. Enemy, friend, civilian. When they needed help, we helped. The world's not much different now, son. People still need help, they just bleed in different ways. Mike stood up suddenly, wiping his eyes. I need to talk to the others, he said. Some of them, they're veterans too. They just don't talk about it. But what we've been doing, it's wrong. As Mike headed for the door, Harold called out, Son? Mike turned. The Veterans Center where I volunteer. We have a young veterans group. Meets on Thursdays. No pressure, no formality, just coffee and conversation. Mike nodded, his hand on the doorknob. Maybe I'll stop by, he paused. And Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry about the flag. We'll make it right. Harold watched from his window as Mike walked back to the warehouse. The young veteran's shoulders seemed straighter now, his step more purposeful. In him, Harold saw a glimpse of hope, not just for his neighborhood's problems, but for a young soldier still fighting battles long after leaving the battlefield. That evening, the usual motorcycle noise from the warehouse was noticeably quieter. Harold sat on his porch, watching the sunset, thinking about how wars never really end for those who fight them. But maybe, just maybe, the enemies we think we're fighting aren't really enemies at all. Sometimes they're just lost soldiers, looking for their way home. After his conversation with Mike, Harold spent a restless night thinking. The next morning, instead of calling the police again, he reached for his old address book. Its pages were worn and yellow, filled with names and numbers collected over decades of military service and volunteer work. His first call was to James Wilson, commander of the local Veterans Support Network. James, Harold said, his voice firm. I need a favor. A big one. Anything for you, Doc, James replied, using Harold's old wartime nickname. You saved my father in '44. Our family never forgets. Harold explained the situation with the bikers, emphasizing Mike's story. These aren't just troublemakers, he said. Some of them are lost veterans. They need to see they're not alone. James understood immediately. Give me 2 hours, he said. I'll make some calls. Harold spent the next hour calling every veteran he knew. Sam Chen, Mrs. Chen's brother, who had served in Vietnam. Robert Martinez, Officer Jenny's father, a Korean War veteran. Young veterans from the center where he volunteered. Old comrades who could still travel. Each call ended the same way. Be here tomorrow at noon. By evening, his phone was buzzing with return calls. Veterans from 3 counties were spreading the word. Even Martha's old nursing colleagues, those still alive, promised to come. Harold's simple call for help had turned into something much bigger. That night, the warehouse was unusually quiet. Through his window, Harold could see Mike talking with small groups of bikers. Some nodded, others argued, but something was definitely changing. The next day dawned bright and clear. At 11:30 a.m., the first vehicles started arriving on Pine Street. Old men in decorated caps, middle-aged veterans with military bumper stickers, young men and women in civilian clothes but with unmistakable military bearing. They parked their cars, trucks, and yes, even motorcycles, along both sides of the street. Mrs. Chen watched in amazement from her porch as more people kept coming. Mr. Rodriguez brought out cold drinks for the gathering crowd. Children peeked through windows at the growing assembly of veterans. At precisely noon, Harold stepped out of his house. He wore his full military dress uniform, preserved carefully since 1945. Despite his age, he stood straight and tall. The torn flag was folded carefully in his hands. Behind him, spanning the entire street, stood over 200 veterans. They represented every American conflict from World War II to Afghanistan. Some used canes or wheelchairs. Others had prosthetic limbs. All stood proudly at attention. The bikers emerged from the warehouse, led by Spike. They stopped short at the sight before them. Mike stepped forward from their group, wearing his own military medals pinned to his leather jacket. These men and women, Harold's voice carried clearly down the street, answered their country's call in different wars, different decades. But we all bled the same blood, felt the same fears, and carried the same hopes. He held up the damaged flag. This flag isn't just about my wife, or my service, or even this country. It's about the bonds between us. Every veteran here understands that. One by one, veterans began sharing their names and service details. John Miller, Iraq, 2003. Sarah Thompson, Afghanistan, 2015. Michael Chen, Vietnam, 1968. The litany continued, a powerful reminder of service spanning generations. Spike looked increasingly uncomfortable. Several of his bikers had removed their helmets, revealing expressions of respect and, in some cases, shame. A few even stepped forward to join the veterans' ranks. "We're not here for confrontation," Harold continued. "We're here because veterans take care of their own, and some of your group, like Mike here, are our own. They just forgot that for a while." He turned to the assembled veterans. "Anyone here ever feel lost after coming home?" Hundreds of hands raised. "Anyone struggle to sleep? To find peace?" More hands. "And who here found help from other veterans?" Every hand stayed up. The message was clear. This wasn't a show of force. It was a show of support. Harold's heroic call hadn't brought warriors ready for battle. Instead, he had gathered a family of veterans ready to help their own find their way back home. The silence that followed Harold's words was broken by an unexpected voice. "My grandfather," Spike said suddenly, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. He cleared his throat and started again. "My grandfather served in World War II." Harold stepped forward, leaning slightly on his cane. "What was his name, son?" "Thomas Reed. He was a tank driver. Never met him. He died before I was born." Spike's usual tough expression wavered. "But my grandmother kept his medals. Used to tell me stories." Harold's eyes widened with recognition. "Tommy Reed? From the 3rd Armored Division?" He turned to the crowd of veterans and called out, "James, bring me that old photo album from my car." James quickly returned with a worn leather album. Harold's weathered fingers carefully turned the pages until he found what he was looking for. "There," he said, holding out the album to Spike. "Third from the left." Spike's hands trembled as he took the album. In the black and white photograph, a young soldier smiled confidently from beside his tank. That's him," Spike whispered. "How?" "Your grandfather's tank unit helped protect our medical station during the Battle of the Bulge," Harold explained. "He used to bring us coffee, said medics needed steady hands." Harold smiled at the memory. "Bravest man I ever met. Saved our whole unit once by drawing enemy fire away from our position." Tears formed in Spike's eyes as he stared at his grandfather's face. Several of his fellow bikers moved closer, their tough exteriors cracking at the sight of their leader's emotion. Mike stepped forward then, his military bearing evident. "Brothers," he addressed the other bikers. "We lost our way. We wanted freedom, respect, brotherhood. But we've been dishonoring the very things that make those values possible." Other bikers began to move forward, some revealing their own military connections. Dave, Spike's second in command, admitted his father was a Vietnam vet who wouldn't speak to him anymore. Johnny, the youngest member, shared that his sister was currently serving in the Air Force. The gathered veterans listened, nodding with understanding. A young female veteran who had served in Iraq walked up to one of the troubled young bikers and simply said, "We get it. We've all been there, but you're not alone anymore." Spike handed the photo album back to Harold with unexpected gentleness. Then, to everyone's surprise, he removed his leather jacket. Underneath was a faded t-shirt with the 3rd Armored Division logo, his grandfather's unit. "Mr. Thompson," Spike said, his voice thick with emotion, "we can't undo what we've done. Maybe we can start making things right." He turned to his group, starting with that flag. One by one, the bikers began removing their jackets. Those who were veterans put on their old unit patches or pins they'd kept hidden. Others revealed connections to military family members they'd never spoken about before. Mrs. Chen, watching from her porch, wiped tears from her eyes as she saw the transformation happening in her street. Mr. Rodriguez's grandchildren cautiously emerged from their house, no longer afraid of the once intimidating bikers. Harold watched as Spike organized his men to clean up the neighborhood they had terrorized. Some repainted the vandalized fence. Others picked up trash from the gardens. Mike and a few others carefully took down the damaged flag, treating it with the respect it deserved. The gathered veterans didn't just watch, they joined in. Young Afghanistan vets worked alongside Vietnam veterans and active duty service members, sharing stories and advice with the reformed bikers. The sound of motorcycles was replaced by conversation, laughter, and occasional tears as people shared their experiences. As the sun began to set on Pine Street, Harold sat on his porch, exhausted but content. Beside him, Spike sat quietly, holding his grandfather's photograph. "Sir," he said finally, "would you tell me more about him?" Harold smiled. "Your grandfather loved coffee too, you know. Always carried extra in his tank for the medics." As he began sharing stories, more people gathered around to listen. The night that followed was filled not with the roar of engines, but with tales of bravery, loss, friendship, and the unbreakable bonds between those who serve. The transformation wasn't just in the clean streets or the quiet evening. It was in the hearts of everyone present, especially the bikers who had found something they'd been searching for all along: a true sense of belonging. 1 month after the memorable gathering on Pine Street, Harold's front yard looked very different. Where there had once been tire tracks and damaged flowers, a new garden bloomed. But more remarkable than the restored lawn was what happened at the old warehouse every Thursday evening. The Night Ravens hadn't disbanded, they'd transformed. Under Spike's leadership, and with guidance from Harold and other veterans, the warehouse had become an unofficial veterans support center. They called it the Bunker, a place where veterans of all ages could find understanding and friendship. The changes were evident everywhere. The warehouse walls, once covered in graffiti, now displayed military unit flags and historical photos. A special place of honor held the photograph of Spike's grandfather beside his tank, next to Harold in his medic uniform. Below these hung a beautifully restored American flag, not Harold's damaged one, but a new one presented to him by the bikers. Every Thursday, motorcycles still rumbled down Pine Street, but now they brought veterans from across the state. Some came for the free coffee and conversation. Others came for the motorcycle maintenance workshop Mike had started, teaching fellow veterans a useful trade. Young vets struggling with civilian life found mentors. Older veterans found purpose in sharing their experiences. Mrs. Chen now regularly provided her famous dumplings for these gatherings. Her grandson, Tommy, once terrified of the bikers, had become their unofficial mascot, proudly wearing a mini leather vest the group had made for him. Mr. Rodriguez hosted weekly barbecues in his backyard, where veterans and neighbors shared meals and stories. The Night Ravens themselves had changed their image completely. Their leather jackets now bore a new patch, a raven carrying a medical cross, designed to honor Harold's service as a medic. Below it read, "Veterans Helping Veterans." They became known for escorting military funerals, organizing charity rides for wounded warriors, and helping disabled veterans with home repairs. Harold's original damaged flag had found a special purpose too. Instead of disposing of it, they had carefully preserved it in a glass case at the bunker. Beside it, a plaque read, "A reminder of where we were and how far we've come." On warm evenings, Harold would sit on his porch, drinking coffee and watching the activities at the warehouse. Often, Spike would join him, eager to hear more stories about his grandfather. Sometimes Mike would bring over young veterans struggling with PTSD, knowing Harold's gentle wisdom could help ease their troubled minds. The neighborhood kids returned to playing in the streets, and now they had unexpected guardians. The bikers became their protectors, teaching them about respect, honor, and the importance of serving others. Several local teenagers even started a junior program, helping veterans with technology and social media. Officer Jenny Martinez still drove by regularly, but now it was to join the conversations rather than respond to complaints. She'd started a program connecting veteran bikers with the police department, building bridges between law enforcement and the community. 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, Harold celebrated his 94th birthday. The party was held in front of his house, spilling over into the warehouse. Veterans from World War II through Afghanistan gathered alongside neighbors, bikers, and friends. The Night Ravens presented him with a custom-made rocking chair built by Spike himself, with Harold's medical corps insignia carved into the headrest. As Harold sat in his new chair, surrounded by this unlikely family, he remembered Martha's words about finding better ways to solve problems. She would have loved this: the healing, the brotherhood, the transformation of anger into purpose. Spike stood up to make a toast. "A year ago, we thought we were tough guys," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet gathering. "But Mr. Thompson showed us what real toughness is. It's not about making noise or causing fear. It's about standing up for what's right, helping others, and building something meaningful." He raised his coffee cup, They'd all given up drinking at their meetings out of respect for recovering veterans. To Harold Thompson, who didn't just show us a better way to live, he showed us how to make our lives matter. As the sun set on Pine Street, the sound of motorcycle engines could still be heard. But now they brought hope instead of fear, brotherhood instead of intimidation. Harold had not only found a way to solve his neighborhood's problem, he had helped create something extraordinary. A place where old wounds could heal, where veterans could find their way home, and where the true meaning of strength and honor could be passed on to the next generation.